Welcome back. Imagine having to configure a different key for every lock in your house. One for your front door, one for your garage, another for each of your bedrooms. Sounds overwhelming, right? Well, today I'm going to show you how to avoid that chaos when you're using Azure Data Factory or Synapse by setting up link services and datasets with parameters, essentially creating a master skeleton key that will make managing your data pipelines much more efficient. So, just to give you a little bit of insight, I'm doing this video today because I noticed that I continue to get views on my short that I created about how to create dynamic datasets in Synapse. That video really was a piece of a long form video where I just briefly covered it. Today, I want to dive a little bit deeper. I'm going to walk you through not only how to set up dynamic datasets, but also link services. We're going to do all of that in Synapse physically in a demo. I'm going to show you step by step how to do it very simply, very easily, in a very digestible manner that you could understand and return to so that you could save this video and come back as you need it for a review. Even so, while you're walking through actually physically creating the same things in Synapse or Data Factory. Really, it's the same process in both. Don't think that it's not. So, in addition, we're going to be talking about some pros and cons of doing it dynamically like this versus having some static ones. There may be situations where having a dynamic link service isn't what you need. So, we'll talk through that towards the end after the demo, so be sure to stay tuned until that point. First, we are going to walk through what are link services and datasets. In Data Factory, link services and datasets are like the foundation of your data pipelines. Think of link services as the address book that stores information about your data sources, like where they live and how to reach them. Datasets, on the other hand, are like the specific data tables or files that live at those addresses. So think of it like when you call a friend's house. Maybe you want to talk to their mom because it's a surprise for your friend. Maybe you want to talk to the friend. Maybe you want to talk to the dad. Who knows? But you're calling the house, when you call the house, that is your link service. The individual person at the house is your data set. But here's the thing. When we're creating those link services and data sets, we have to use parameters. So without parameters, setting these up can feel like managing dozens of keys and addresses, all separate from each other. Every time that you add a new environment or a new data source, it means more configuration. So that's where we're going to create it in a little bit more dynamic manner, and that's where parameters come in. So think of parameters as a container to hold your specific request for that link service or for that data set. Again, it's like a bucket or a container that you could pass direct information, specific information to those link services and data sets to get the information that you're looking for. So think of parameters as a universal key, one that will open multiple locks with just some slight adjustments. We'll start by setting up a link service with parameters, and by using parameters, we can make our link services dynamic. Imagine that you have a dev, test, and production environment. Instead of creating separate link services for each, we'll use a parameter so that we could switch in between them depending on the situation that we're in. So step by step. First, we're going to set up a new linked service in Synapse. Instead of hard coding the connection details, we'll be adding parameters for the server name and the database name. This gives us that flexibility and dynamic effect that we're looking for. Once we've created our link service, it's time to use it in our dataset. When we define a dataset, we'll also use parameters. This will make things like table names and file paths and schemas more flexible. This means that we can handle multiple data sets using the same template, changing just a couple of the parameters each time that we use it. Let's dive into that demo right now. That haven't been in it before, this is Azure Synapse. So I love Synapse. It's a great ETL tool and orchestration tool, and has your analytics data in it. It has your ADLS, your SQL Server. Everything's all in one place. You create notebooks. It's super cool. But today we're talking about link services and datasets. So let's get into it. How to create a dynamic link service. So here, you'll see on the left-hand side, we have some icons here. We have our home, our data, develop, integrate, monitor, and manage. Integrate is where you create your ETL pipelines. Manage is where we are going to create our link services. So up here, we'll click on our plus for new. We're going to search for SQL. And we're going to see SQL Server. So today we're connecting to an on-prem SQL Server. It's very similar when you're connecting to an Azure SQL Server. And I'll show you that in a future video. But today we're going to connect to a local SQL Server. We're going to hit continue. We're going to call this dynamic SQL. Here we could put in a description. So creating a dynamic SQL Server connection. For our connection integration runtime, we're going to use our local integration runtime, again, because we're connecting to our local SQL Server. If you're using things like a Bastion, or you're connecting to a server that is hosted within Azure, you'll use your auto-resolving, or you'll create a specific runtime specific to the region that your resources are built in. I would always recommend building a integrated runtime that is specific to that region, as the auto-resolving sometimes will have some connection issues. All right. You'll notice that when you click in the server name, it gives us this option down here, add dynamic content. But first, let's actually scroll down to the bottom. Under parameters, we're going to expand this, and we're going to add a new parameter, and we're going to call it server name. We'll create one for server name, one for the database name, and one for the username. And this is how we'll do it. Server name. We'll leave it as a string. You could put in a default value if you want. It's not required. But if there is a default value, default connection string server name, then be sure to add that. Database name, DB, you'll see often used as an abbreviation for database. Again, you put a value. We're not going to right now. We're going to put in user name. And finally, we're going to put in key vault secret. Key vault password secret. And this is going to be the name of our secret in our key vault that is holding our password. So these are all parameters that we could pass in from our pipeline that gets created, or from the data set. So this way you create one link service for all of your on-prem SQL servers. We're going to come back up here for our server name. We're going to hit add dynamic content. We're going to use server name. We're going to say OK. Database name. Again, you have to click in it before this add dynamic content comes up. Click add dynamic content. We're going to say database name. And then for our authentication type, we're going to leave it at SQL authentication, but you can use Windows or user assigned managed identity. Today we're going to use our SQL authentication. Again, click in the username, add dynamic content, choose your username, hit OK. Now, for our password, we're going to choose Azure Key Vault. I would always recommend securing your information in the Key Vault. It's a great tool. It's a great resource. It's super cheap. It's like 1 cent per secret. So it's not super expensive to use. We're going to select our Key Vault service. It's going to load our secret names from our secret manager. And you'll see that there's some in here. But that's not what we're going to do. Again, we are making this as dynamic as possible. So we're going to hit Add Dynamic Content, and we're going to say Key Vault Password Secret, and we're going to say OK. And what that's going to do is it's going to put that parameter name in there. We're always going to want to use our latest version. We're going to say Trust Server Certificate. The encrypt is going to be mandatory. And we're going to test connection. When we test our connection, it's going to require us to put in those values, some default values. So we're going to populate those default values. Again, this is going to be my local SQL server. For our database name, put in our database name. For our username, put in my username. And for our Key Vault password, we're going to say GDE dev PW. We're going to say OK, and it's going to test our connection. It may take 20 seconds or so to test the connection. It was actually very quick this time, so our connection is successful, and we're good to go. It's as easy as that. The only step that I didn't have to do here that you will probably have to do the first time that you set this up is if you are using a local integrated runtime, there's a file there's a program that you have to download. It's your local integrated runtime. You'll see on my computer, I have a integration runtime configuration manager already set up. However, to do that, all you have to do, if you need to re-download it, if you need to uninstall it and reinstall it, you'll hit this little pencil beside your integrated runtime, and it'll give you the option to click here to launch the express setup for this computer. What that's going to do is it's going to download the program that it needs to install along with all the configurations for your local integrated runtime. So super cool, super easy. In addition, you can manually do it. You could download and install the integrated runtime, and then you've got your key pairs here. As easy as that. It is not super complicated. And now you have a dynamic link service that you could use for all of your SQL servers. All of your SQL servers hosted on this machine. Now, if you are in an organization, if you're in a business that has a VM with some on-prem within that VM SQL servers, you could download and install. You'll need to download and install this integrated runtime on that server. And so that way that integrated runtime is hosted on that VM, which is a virtual machine, and you don't have to worry about your laptop or your personal computer being on in order for that integrated runtime to run, in order for that link service to link to that database. So that's my recommendation if you're using a local integrated runtime. Again, when I was at AT&T, we used a Bastion, and so we connected to that Bastion via just the regular runtimes, the regular integration runtimes. And so they weren't local to a computer. We hit a Bastion, and then that Bastion connected to the various on-prem databases. In addition, we're going to hit create here, and you'll see that it gets created pretty quickly. You'll see it creates right here, Dynamic SQL. It's a SQL server. And I'm going to show you a couple of other link services. So that was SQL Server. Let's do another one. And let's do a REST API. So we're going to connect to a REST API. We're going to make this dynamic for the API. But here's the thing. For APIs, I would recommend doing each of your APIs separate. You don't want just one blanket REST connection for every API. You may need to have some control over that because your authentication type is probably going to be different from API to API. Your username, password, things like that are going to be different. So let's do the Rick and Morty one. I'm going to have to pull up some of my parameters for the Rick and Morty one. There we go. So here you'll see that we could use the auto-resolving runtime. I'm going to create a new runtime just to show you how to do it. Oop. Okay. Wrong thing. Hit the drop down, hit new. We're going to say Azure. We're going to say continue. We're going to name this GDE US East 1. Oh, 2. Nope. East 1. I think that's where I'm at. So you could use dashes, but not underscores in here. Depending on the resource, depending on the thing in Synapse and in Azure, you could use underscores, or you could use dashes, or you could use neither. I always get confused on which one's which until it pops up and tells me, hey, you can't use an underscore here. So here we want to define the region. You'll see that I only have US East US as a option here, and that's because that's where this resource is hosted. For our virtual network, we're going to leave it at disable. We don't have a virtual network set up. Our data flow runtime, we're going to leave it at small so that it doesn't run up our bill real quick. There's some advanced options here. You'll see that when we change this to medium, the core count and the time to live can be different. We could set custom. We could say it like if you need your compute to spin up immediately, then you could say time to live 0 minutes. Again, it's going to increase the cost of your runtime. So be careful of that. You could adjust, again, the core count. This is just how many driver cores that runtime has. So if you have something that is very laborious, if you have queries that you know that are running that are very laborious and that you need that speed and that power, then you could increase the driver cores. The reality is that for most things, you could probably do with a smaller one. Not a big deal here. So we're going to leave it at small. I'm okay with the time to live being 10 minutes. And you could hit create. So it really does take about 10 minutes if this gets suspended, which it does, which is a good thing, right? You want your integrated runtime to suspend when it's not being used, again, so it doesn't run up your cost on your Synapse resource. You'll see that it has a big red X right now. And again, that's because it is not on. Status is running actually. So yeah, there it is. It takes a few seconds. You'll notice that just took a few seconds. A lot of times it'll pick up a lot quicker than that 10 minutes. So our base URL for our Rick and Morty API is rickandmortyapi.com/API. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is an API for various data on the show, about the show Rick and Morty, about all the episodes. Can be very detailed. Names of episodes, descriptions, things like that. Specifically, who is in each episode. Authentication type here is going to be anonymous. So we don't actually need a username and password to hit this. This is a free API, so if it's something that you want to connect to and play with, you could do that. I do have another full video. You should check that out about connecting to the Rick and Morty API and pulling various data. So there's not a whole lot of dynamicity. I probably just made up that word. There's nothing very dynamic about this, but I want to set it up so that when we create the data sets, that will be dynamic, because we'll create one data set for all of the various API calls that we can call from this. Then it's there in setup, and you know how to set up a REST API now. We'll hit test connection. It should come back successful immediately. We're going to hit create, and you'll see that the Rick and Morty REST API is now created. Now, very important here, Once you get some stuff created in here, you're going to see this publish button up at the top near the center, just to the left of center. You're going to want to publish all. It's going to tell you what it's going to publish. You're going to hit publish. There's an extra step here that will be potentially created if you are connected to your GitHub, to a Git repository that will push that data into Git as well. So everything pushes from Synapse into Git as JSON data, if you don't know. So for instance, I could come here. You can't do it with connections, link connections. There it is. You click on that, and you'll see all the JSON format of that link connection. And you could manually go through and change things here as well without having to use the visual tool, the GUI. All right. Next step is going to be to create a new data set for these link services that we just created. So to do that, we're going to go up to data. We're going to make sure that linked is selected here. We're going to hit this plus sign. There's several options here. The thing we're looking for here is integration data set. It's going to give us a very similar list to what we looked at when we were creating our link services. You could type in SQL. It's going to filter for SQL. We could hit our SQL server. We'll hit continue. We're going to name it. Today we're going to name it Dynamic SQL Connection, Dynamic SQL Dataset. DS stands for dataset. And we're going to choose our link service. We only have one, Dynamic SQL. But here, it gives us an option to select a table name. We don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually click on Enter Manually. And we're just going to say, OK here. And it's going to create our data set. Now, there's still a bunch of things that we have to do here. Now, remember, similarly to how we created our link services, we need to create some parameters. Specifically, we need to hit Enter Manually again. And you'll notice that we have our schema name and our table name options here. We need to create those two parameters, but we also need to create the 4 parameters for what we need to pass into the link services, so that when we connect this to a pipeline, then we could feed these parameters into the pipeline. Then the data set will feed those same parameters into our link service to make that connection. So we'll come over here. We're going to create 6 parameters, the 4 for our link services and the 2 that we need for our data set. So let's start with our data set. So we need a schema name, and then we need our table name. Again, when you're creating these parameters, it is easy to want to abbreviate things. You can do some abbreviations, TBL for table, if you want things like that, VW for view when you're creating different things. But try to get into the habit of spelling things out. It's easier for people that come in after you that may not have followed the same kind of abbreviation patterns that you have in the past, and might be easier for you down the line if you are abbreviating something other than something simple like table. All right, now we need our 4 parameters for our link services. We need our server name, our database name, username, and our key value, or our key vault password secret. So we need our server name. And while you don't have to necessarily name them the same, I would name them the same so for consistency's sake and to make sure that you understand what's going where. So you could even come here and copy and paste if you don't want to type. And also that makes sure that you definitely have named them identically. We are going to leave everything at string. You'll notice that there are some other options here. Integer, float, bool is boolean, so true, false. You could do arrays, objects, secure strings. We're going to talk real quickly after I do this part about a interview question that I actually had during a Chase interview. that has to do very similarly to dynamic data sets and dynamic link services, and I'll tell you more about that interview question later and how you might answer that. So we've created our parameters. Now we need to come back over here to connection. Again, click in the box, and then you'll see the add dynamic content. You'll want to add the appropriate parameter for each of these things. Our password secret. Now, again, for the table, we need to add the schema name and table name. So we'll click here. We'll add our schema name. We'll add our table name. And then we'll publish. And it's as easy as that. Easy as that. Click on publish. It's going to publish. And again, you find that under the data section, the little looks like a little database icon. So if this is collapsed, then you'll see the little database icon. If you hover over any of them, it'll give you the actual title for them. You'll notice that in the data, we also have our ADLS container, Azure Data Lake Storage. So one of the things that I love about Synapse is everything's kind of all in one workspace. Very similar to how you have it in Fabric. So if you haven't checked out Fabric, you can do that. I think you get a 90-day trial. Super expensive to do ongoing, so try to use that 90-day trial for everything that you can. But yeah. So again, I like Synapse because everything's all in one place. So that's how you create a dynamic connection to your data set, to your link services, directly into a SQL server. We're going to do one more, again, just for practice. This one is going to be to the REST API that we created. So again, we're going to hit our plus sign, integration data set. We're going to type in REST. You'll see our REST API. Hit continue. We're going to call this Rick and Morty DS. Our link service is going to be Rick and Morty. Again, because this one is more specific, our REST API is more specific because for each API, your authentication is going to be a little different. So the link service, you'll want to have not dynamic. You'll want it to be more static. But for your data set, you can have it be dynamic so that you'd use one data set for all your API calls, and you just pass in the specific API call. All right, we'll hit OK. Again, you'll see this come up. So kind of similar, not nearly as many options. REST APIs aren't nearly as complicated as connecting to a database, but you'll see our base URL has populated here. You'll see we have a place for a relative URL. Now, here's one other thing that you could do. Instead of going over to the parameters tab and creating parameters that way, you could create them directly here by hitting add dynamic content. In the parameters section, you could click on the little plus sign beside parameters and actually create your parameter here. Like with every other Microsoft product, with Excel, Word, there are 10 different ways to do the same thing. So you're doing the same thing, a little bit different format, but you're doing really the same thing. You're creating a parameter. So let's call this relative URL. And relative, you'll also often see abbreviated as REL, just so that you know that for those of you that are aspiring data professionals. We could put a default value in here. We're not going to do that. We're going to hit save. We're going to add our URL to that. We're going to hit OK. And it'll populate that in there. As easy as that. Super simple, not real complex to set it up. Then what this does is it has your base URL. You'll be able to pass in whatever the extended URL is. If you missed our video on APIs and you don't know what I'm talking about when I say relative URLs and base URLs, be sure to check that out. It was done a while back, but the video's up. So I'll put that link down in the description of the video. And if you're interested in doing something more complex with APIs, put API down in the comments, and Al will build a new video based on a little bit more complex API call. All right, we'll hit publish all. You'll see Rick and Morty dataset. You'll notice that I did abbreviate dataset as DS. That is pretty common, just like view is abbreviated VW, table TBL, procedure PROC. All right, and it's saved. As easy as that. Not anything super complex. All right, so coming up next, I'm going to go over really quickly that interview question from Chase, and then we'll talk about some pros and cons of when to do this, when not to do this, and kind of, the advantages and disadvantages of dynamic data sets. As promised, I have a real-life interview question for you. So, when I was interviewing with Chase several years back, I was in an interview, and one of the first questions that they asked me was, if you had multiple tables that you needed to update in a SQL server, and you needed to do that with a Synapse pipeline, how would you do it dynamically and be able to feed that all the different mappings into the pipeline? And at the time, I didn't know. I had no clue. It was probably about 7 years ago now. I hadn't been in Azure very long, and it hadn't come up for me. So I'm going to tell you how to do it now. Very similarly to how we've set up our link services and our dynamic data sets, you would do that. Start with that. Create your data set so that it's dynamic, so that you could feed in tables and schemas. And then what you do is, in your parameters in your pipeline, you could create parameters for all of your mappings. And so you could feed it either as an array, you could feed it in as JSON. JSON strings is probably what you need to do. And then you could loop through that same data set over and over again, looping through each of those JSON strings in your array that you put into your parameter in your pipeline. So that's one way to do it. If you'd like for me to do a full demo on what that looks like, be sure to put an comment interview question down in the comments below. And if I get enough interest, then I'll go out and create that video for you so that you could have that full understanding of what that looks like in a real life scenario. I've done it several times now. Especially when I was at my previous position, creating some using the same kind of methodology that we've gone over today. So, real world interview question, it may come up for you. Be sure that you're prepared with your answer. Be sure that you've practiced doing it. Again, if you want to see me do a full demo on that, comment below interview question. Now that we've talked about how to set things up dynamically for both our link services and our datasets, let's talk about why this can be a blessing and a curse. In my 25 years, I've ran into very different scenarios. A couple times I inherited ADF instances that had a very large footprint, and they had static, which means that they were not parameterized, so they didn't have parameters set up, datasets and link services, and many of them needed to be updated with new connection information or removed altogether because they weren't being used anymore. This led me to learn how to create these dynamic link services and datasets that you've learned today. By using parameters, you achieve a level of reusability that really saves a lot of time. Imagine that you have dozens and dozens of tables to work with, and instead of having to create individual data sets for each one of those tables, now you know how to use parameters to create one dynamic data set that can adjust based on the input values. This also makes your maintenance easier. If there's a change to the environment, you update it in one place, and everything downstream inherits those changes. Pretty powerful, right? However, with great power comes some changes and some challenges. One of the main cons here is complexity. Using parameters makes your pipeline more abstract, so it makes it a little bit more moving pieces there because of the parameters. So it could mean that troubleshooting issues can sometimes be a little bit more challenging. However, if something does go wrong, you can trace it back through the parameter values and figure out where something was misconfigured. In addition, Azure does a good job of providing some error logging, and it'll give you pretty specifically where you need to look, at least where to start. And so, if you aren't familiar with the use of parameters, then onboarding and understanding what's happening under the hood can take a little bit extra time. So be sure that as you're doing this, you have some thorough documentation, whether you're using Purview or you're just putting things into a SharePoint. Be sure that you're documenting well what your parameters are, where you're using them, where your key vaults are, so that somebody else can come in behind you and make the updates and ramp up quickly. So, what do you think about dynamic datasets and link services? Have you tried to create parameters in your link services and datasets before? Drop a comment below and let me know how that went. If you haven't done it yet, go out and try it. Let me know what your challenges are. Let me know what you think could maybe make things better. We all can learn from each other. So, if you're just starting out, be sure to let me know what challenges and roadblocks that you're facing, as that will help me to develop future content. So to recap, link services and datasets are foundational for your ADF and Synapse pipelines, and making them dynamic is like having a universal key that can open many doors. It simplifies your setup, making it reusable, and helps you to maintain fewer configuration points. Just remember, the pros: efficiency, reusability, and scalability must be balanced against the complexity of dynamic pipelines. With a little practice, it will become second nature to you. Before we wrap up, let's discuss a couple of interview questions that reflect on real-world challenges you might come across when it comes to setting up link services and datasets in ADF. So, the first question I want you to think about is, what are the advantages of using parameters in link services and datasets? So this question is designed to assess your understanding of how dynamic setups can help in terms of reusability, scalability, and maintenance. Let me know your answer below, and I'll go through and provide you feedback. How would you troubleshoot an issue with parameterized link services that aren't connecting properly? Here, the interviewer wants to know, how would you go about debugging issues? So this is testing your troubleshooting ability. So be sure that you're checking parameter values, connectivity, even tracing through the logs to identify what the root cause is. Again, like I mentioned before, Azure does a pretty good job with some error logging. If a parameterized link service isn't connecting properly, you could start by verifying the parameter values in the link services configuration. If it's something where it was at one time connecting properly and has changed, it may be something as simple as a password has changed or a key is rotated that you need to update in your key vault. Another step could be using the debug tool in ADF or Synapse to see what actual values are being passed in the execution. So again, in the monitor, you go in there and see what is actually being passed from one parameter to another. Be sure to share your answers below, and I'll go in and provide feedback and suggestions on how you might reformat your answers. So these questions can help you to prepare for situations where you need to showcase not just your technical skills, but your troubleshooting ability and problem-solving skills as well. If you want to see how to put these concepts into practical use in real-world pipelines, be sure to check out my video on the Marvel pipeline. And for more data on engineering tools like Python, don't forget to explore this playlist, which is our Python tutorials. I'll see you next time.